Conditions May Apply by CinnamonPinecones. Read by Distracted by Books. Chapter 55, The Aftermath. Izuku was reeling. He was feeling so many things that he didn't know what to think, and he did his best to stomp all of it down for Shinso-san's sake. She was worried enough. She shouldn't have to deal with him as well. The short drive back to the Shinso's house was painfully silent, and Izuku spent the entirety of it in the back seat, looking back and forth between the Shinsos. He couldn't see either of their faces from back here, but Shinso hadn't moved a muscle since he sat down, and he could imagine his face still held that blank expression it had since the cops showed up. He was worried about that. Izuku will admit that his definition of a traumatizing event was probably skewed, but barely anything happened, and Shinso did not look very present. He looked like he was lost somewhere else, and Izuku knew far too intimately what that felt like. Something like this had happened to Shinso before, and he wasn't seeing things clearly, but that wasn't any of his business, so he kept his mouth shut. It wouldn't help anyone to prod for information anyway. When they pulled up to the Shinso's house, Shinso-san guided both of them through the door before kicking her dirtied house slippers off and helping Shinso with his laces. She kept glancing over to Izuku, and he didn't know what to say. He didn't know what she wanted. She shot another look at him before turning her attention to Shinso. "Toshi, baby, why don't you go take a shower, okay?" she said as she gently nudged him towards the stairs. Shinso looked back to Izuku with a concerned expression. He was worried about him. Izuku offered a reassuring smile and nodded for him to go up the stairs. Shinso-san watched him go and listened closely until she heard the water turn on before she looked back to him. "Are you all right, Midoriya?" she asked. "Yeah, I'm fine. We had it under control," he assured. He wanted to ask her about Shinso, about what had happened, but he held his tongue. "Do you mind telling me what happened?" The officer gave a very brief overview, so I don't really... And Toshi seems... She trailed off. "No, I don't mind. I noticed the guy was following us, and I tried to tell Shinso I could take care of it if he got too close, but he had an elasticity quirk, and he grabbed Shinso and tried to grab me from like 30 feet away. He had Shinso by the jacket, so I stomped on his arm, and he let go. I told Shinso to run, and I was about to take him down, but Shinso, he took control and stopped him himself, and then he just he looked like he wasn't really seeing what was happening. He didn't want to pry, but he was worried. Has something like this happened to him before? He looked like he was having a flashback." He trailed off. Shinso-san had a hand pressed over her mouth. She looked like she was halfway to a crisis, but she rubbed her hand over her face and regained her composure. "Yes, it has." "Kami, you sure you're all right, kid?" she asked again. "Yeah, I'm fine, honest," he reassured. "I'm just worried about him." Of course, he was just worried about Toshi. He was Midoriya. She was also worried about Toshi. She'd never seen him like this, even when he was a little kid and woke up screaming from nightmares. He would just cry and curl up next to her in her bed. She'd never seen this, and he used his quirk right in front of Midoriya. That probably wasn't helping him, but Midoriya didn't seem to give a rat's ass about the quirk. She knew he wouldn't, but Toshi was always so worried about it, and now all of this at once? Kami, that poor kid. Both of them. Her poor babies. Midoriya, is that family friend of yours going to be over tonight? She asked. No, not tonight. I'll see him tomorrow, he replied. Why don't you spend the night then? I don't want you alone. I know you said you're fine. I just. She trailed off. That's fine. I can stay, he soothed. Why the hell was he trying to calm her down? This kid was something else. Why don't we order some takeout? I ruined dinner by dropping half of it on the floor after I got that call, she said, trying to lighten the mood. That's all right. Why don't why don't I help you clean it up? He offered, because of course he did. She'd noticed that the kid seemed far less tense whenever she let him help with things. So, with a sigh, she let him help, and as they were soaking up broth and gathering rice off the kitchen floor, she tried to convince him that the katsudon from the restaurant up the road was 10 times better than hers, but he wasn't having it. He kept insisting that that was impossible, and she couldn't help but laugh. He looked so determined about it. Well, why don't we get some to settle the debate? Toshi likes their ramen, and they deliver super fast since they're so close. I think I just heard Toshi get out of the shower. Why don't you go swap with him? I'll grab you some clothes in a minute. After he awkwardly shuffled out of the kitchen, she took a few deep breaths and got to work. She went and grabbed all the futons and blankets around the house as she sandwiched her phone between her ear and shoulder and placed their order. She tossed everything in the living room floor and went to go grab Midoriya some clothes and check in on Toshi. Hey, Toshi, she said after lightly knocking on his door. He was sitting at his desk chair in his PJs, still looking a little bit distant. I'm going to grab some PJs for Midoriya. And I got you some of that ramen from the place up the road, okay? She said. He only nodded in response. Why don't you come downstairs? I'm setting us up for a movie night in the living room, she said. He gave another shaky nod, got to his feet, and shuffled past her down the stairs. Well, at least he was present. A little shaken, but present. She'll take what she could get. He saw. Midoriya saw everything, and he was staying the night. Why was he still here? Why wasn't he afraid? He was scared shitless the whole time he was at the dojo, but when they were getting attacked, nothing. He was as calm as could be, and now he was staying the night over at the house of someone who could make them feel however they wanted him to, and someone else who can use their body as a puppet. They could do anything to him. Why was he still here? He just trusted them? Just like that? He kept this from him the whole time, nearly 2 years, and he's just fine with that? There's no way he could just be fine with that. He sat on the couch, stewing in his disbelief, while his mother arranged a sea of blankets on the floor. He couldn't help the tension that settled on his shoulders as he heard Midoriya come down the stairs. He forced himself to look up when he entered the living room, but he just shot him a smile and sat down next to him. He just sat down in the spot he always did, like nothing happened at all. Hitoshi felt like he was going crazy. The 3 of them curled up in their own little cocoons on the floor and ate their dinners as they watched movies. Shinso-san didn't even make it to the end of the first one before she passed out, but that was to be expected of someone who went to bed promptly at 10:30 every night. Shinso stayed up for the next movie, but he looked exhausted. His eyelids kept drifting downward, and he looked like he was fighting against them. By the time the second movie ended, he had also fallen asleep, so Izuku just turned off the TV for them and finally allowed himself a moment to process things. He crept out the back door and sat on the swing he'd fixed when he first started coming over here. It was frigid out in the mid-November night, but he didn't want to wake up Shinso-san with whatever was going on in his head. He was worried and impressed and angry, but more than anything, he felt useless. He had spent the last 2 years of his life putting everything he had into playing hero, but Shinso did what he was going to do with 2 words and a thought. And no one even got hurt. He didn't have to train. He didn't have to fight. He just had a quirk. He just had a quirk, and he could do anything Izuku could so much easier and so much better. He thought about how Shinso was so ashamed of his quirk, of how he said it wasn't suited for heroics, and it just made him angry. It was selfish. He's sure Shinso has his reasons for thinking that, but he couldn't help it. Shinso had the potential to be something amazing. He was just born with it. It was a part of him. He had inherent worth that Izuku could never even dream of, and it made him sick. It wasn't fair. It's not the first time the thought occurred to him, but it still tasted like bile on his tongue. The thought that he could be angry at Shinso right now only made it worse. He was being selfish. Shinso had clearly gone through something awful. He was traumatized, but he still saved them. He should be grateful, but instead he was just mad. He tried to put himself in Shinso's shoes. He could imagine people who knew about his quirk didn't trust him. He could imagine that people would be afraid of him, but he couldn't stop thinking that at least he had something. At least he had a mother who still loved him. At least he had a home. At least he had a friend who learned about his big old secret and stuck around anyway. He was crying now. He felt the hot tears roll down his windburned cheeks, and he just felt so much worse for it. It wasn't fair. It had never been fair. He needed to accept that. He needed to move on because all this misplaced anger wasn't fair to Shinso either. He stayed out there on the swing until he couldn't feel his limbs anymore, until his anger melted away into grief and he was once again left to mourn the life that he could have had. He stayed there until he could pack up that familiar sorrow in a jar and screw the lid on tight. He stayed there until he could will his weary soul to be thankful for what he had, and then he stood up on shaky frozen legs and stumbled back inside. When Hitoshi got up that morning, it was to the sound of Midoriya and his mother talking in the kitchen the next room over. The smell of breakfast cooking was delicious, and he went to go join them, but before he could even throw the blanket off of himself, he remembered why he was down here in the living room. What had happened last night, what Midoriya had seen. He acted no differently last night. He was a little more quiet, but otherwise nothing. Now he was in the kitchen, arguing with his mother about how her katsudon was superior to what they'd ordered last night. They were laughing. Midoriya knew about them. He knew what they could do, and he was just laughing and trying to bully his mom into letting him help with breakfast. Part of him was waiting for the other shoe to drop, but another part of him felt stupid for ever thinking that Midoriya would ever think less of him for what he could do. That part of him made him feel like a real asshole. How could he know Midoriya this whole time and still think there was even a possibility that he would be so cruel? He would never begrudge him for something he couldn't help, right? The first part of him both craved reassurance and kept him rooted in place. Midoriya was still here. He didn't care about what Hitoshi could do. He wasn't afraid of him. He wasn't going to leave. He chanted that like a mantra in his head as he forced himself to stand. When he walked into the kitchen, Midoriya looked up and smiled at him and said good morning like nothing happened at all. Like nothing happened at all. End of chapter.